Kael did not return to Helios immediately. Instead, he spent the next 2 hours searching for the person who had contacted him. He reviewed every angle of the cafe, every security camera, every reflective surface, every face that had entered or left while he was there. Nothing. No suspicious movements. No unexplained departures. No trace of anyone watching him. The sender had vanished completely. Kael examined the message data again. The communicator identification had been encrypted beyond anything available on civilian networks. Even the military systems he remembered from later years would have struggled to trace it. That alone was enough to unsettle him. Whoever had sent those messages was not ordinary. More importantly, they knew about Project Horizon. And they knew about him. By the time Kael returned to Helios, the afternoon briefing had already begun. Director Han stood near the entrance with his arms folded. The professional smile he normally wore had disappeared. Late on your first day? My apologies, Director. Kael lowered his head slightly and kept his tone humble. There was no benefit in attracting further attention. Director Han studied him for a moment, then sighed and gestured toward the briefing room. Just sit down. Kael entered without argument. The researchers were reviewing unusual atmospheric readings recorded during the previous 72 hours. Graphs covered the main simulation wall, cloud formations, electromagnetic disturbances, changes in atmospheric density. Most of the researchers treated the data as an interesting scientific curiosity. Kael saw something else. Every rising line represented humanity moving closer to extinction. Every anomaly was another step toward the end. He sat near the back and quietly followed the presentation. Then the display changed. A new slide appeared. Only for a moment, less than 3 seconds. But Kael saw it. Coordinates. A specific location in the Pacific Ocean. His eyes widened. Those coordinates should not have existed. Not in public records. Not in ordinary Helios reports. Not this early. Yet they were clearly visible on the screen. Kael knew the location. He remembered it from a previous life. The Abyssal Scar. A region of ocean where the first atmospheric rupture would eventually appear. A place where navigation systems failed without explanation, where entire fleets later vanished, where the first ocean-borne monsters emerged after impact. In one timeline, humanity had sent an international expedition to investigate it. No one returned. In another, the area expanded until it consumed thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Abyssal Scar had always been one of the earliest signs that the planet was changing. But humanity did not discover it until after the apocalypse began. Helios already knew. Director Han changed the slide. Too quickly. Almost as though it had never been intended for the briefing. Several researchers looked confused. A few whispered to one another. Most ignored it and continued taking notes. Only Kael understood what he had seen, or so he thought. Across the room, Lin Yuxin was staring directly at him. Their eyes met, only for a second. Then she looked away. But Kael had already noticed something in her expression. Recognition, not familiarity. She did not know him. Not in this timeline. It was the look of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. A cold sensation traveled down Kael's spine. Had she noticed him watching Project Horizon? Had she also recognized the coordinates? Or had she discovered something else entirely? Kael looked back toward the simulation wall. The ordinary atmospheric briefing continued as though nothing had happened. But the situation was no longer ordinary. Project Horizon possessed information that should not yet exist. Lin Yuxin had noticed his reaction, and somewhere outside Helios, an unknown person knew that Kael remembered the future. The workday finally ended at 6 in the evening. Most of the interns gathered their belongings and headed home. Kael did not. Warehouse District 9 could wait. Project Horizon could not be entered without preparation. And the unknown sender had already proven impossible to find. For now, Kael needed someone he could trust when the world became dangerous, someone who had survived beside him in countless previous lives, someone who adapted faster than almost anyone he had ever known. Shen Guowei. The evening rush covered New Tianjing in neon light. Elevated trains crossed between towers, while streams of autonomous vehicles filled the highways below. Enormous advertisements illuminated entire city blocks, promising longer lives, smarter cities, and a better future. A century of progress. 6 days away from collapse. Kael left the science district and traveled east. The polished towers gradually disappeared behind him. Buildings became shorter. Public systems became older. Cracks showed beneath faded wall panels. And delivery drones shared narrow streets with vehicles that should have been retired years ago. This was one of New Tianjing's older residential districts. Most of the people living here belonged to the city's lower-income workforce. They kept the capital functioning. They simply received fewer of its benefits. Kael stepped off the transit platform and continued on foot. He already knew where to look. In every timeline, Shen Guowei became one of humanity's strongest survivors. Not because he possessed supernatural abilities, not because he was a brilliant scientist, and certainly not because he had been trained for war. Shen Guowei survived because he adapted faster than almost anyone Kael had ever met. When others panicked, he acted. When others fled, he fought. When others waited for rescue, Shen Guowei created opportunities. By the third year of the apocalypse, entire settlements depended on him. He led supply runs through infested cities, established transport routes between isolated safe zones, and repeatedly entered places no one else was willing to approach. Unfortunately, 6 days before the end of the world, Shen Guowei was delivering food. Kael reached a convenience store near the edge of the district. A black delivery motorcycle was parked beside the entrance. The vehicle had seen better days. Several body panels were scratched, and one side had been repaired with mismatched components. A delivery rider stood nearby, 26 years old. Lean and athletic beneath a black and yellow delivery jacket. Messy black hair escaped from beneath the helmet he held under one arm. A large delivery backpack rested against the motorcycle, and exhaustion seemed permanently carved into his face. Kael recognized him immediately. Shen Guowei, the man who had once carried Kael across 30 kilometers of ruined city while both of them were bleeding. The man who had held a collapsing gate alone so hundreds of civilians could escape. The man who had died protecting him in more than one timeline. Right now, he was arguing with an angry customer. I delivered it exactly where the system told me. The customer pointed toward the neighboring apartment blocks. You delivered it to Building B. The address says Building B. I meant Building D. Shen Guowei stared at him. Then why did you write Building B? The customer opened his mouth, paused, then took the food and walked away without answering. Shen Guowei watched him leave. After several seconds, he released a long, exhausted sigh. Kael almost laughed. Some things never changed, not even across timelines. He approached the motorcycle. Shen Guowei? The delivery rider looked up. His brown eyes immediately examined Kael from head to toe. Helios identification badge. Office clothes. No delivery order. No obvious reason to be there. Do I know you? No. Shen Guowei frowned. Then why are you smiling like we're old friends? Kael's expression froze. Fair point. He had known Shen Guowei for years. They had traveled together, fought together, survived together, but none of that had happened yet. Not for the man standing in front of him. Kael considered several possible explanations. None of them sounded convincing. Finally, he chose the most direct one. Let's say I know your future. Shen Guowei stared at him, then slowly pointed toward the convenience store. They sell medication inside. Kael rubbed his forehead. That came out wrong. Very wrong. I need to speak with you. About my future? Yes. That isn't making this sound better. Kael glanced toward the motorcycle. You've finished your current delivery. Shen Guowei's eyes narrowed. How do you know that? Your delivery bag is empty. Shen Guowei looked down at the open backpack, then back at Kael. That answer was disappointingly normal. I can give you the abnormal explanation inside. The rider remained silent. His posture appeared relaxed, but Kael recognized the change immediately. Shen Guowei had shifted his weight, positioned himself closer to the motorcycle, kept one hand free, ready to move if Kael became a threat. Those instincts had kept him alive for years after civilization fell. They were already present, unrefined, but present. After a moment, Shen Guowei picked up his helmet. Fine. He gestured toward the convenience store. But you're buying the coffee. Several minutes later, they sat across from each other inside the small cafe area. Shen Guowei folded his arms and studied Kael with open suspicion. Kael placed his communicator on the table, but kept the screen dark. Recruiting Shen Guowei after the apocalypse had always been simple. By then, the monsters provided all the evidence Kael needed. Recruiting him before the world ended was different. Now Kael had to convince a complete stranger to trust him. Chen Wei leaned back. All right. His eyes remained fixed on Kael. Start from the beginning. Kael took a quiet breath. There was no safe way to explain what came next. So he began with the truth. Chen Wei leaned back in his chair. So let me get this straight. He lifted his coffee but did not drink. You're a fresh graduate. Correct. You met me less than 10 minutes ago. Correct. You somehow know my name. Correct. And now you want to offer me a job. Also correct. Chen Wei stared at him. Are you part of a cult? No. A pyramid scheme? No. Illegal organ harvesting? No. The delivery rider nodded slowly. That is exactly what an illegal organ harvester would say. Kael sighed. This was harder than he remembered. In previous timelines, he had always recruited Chen Wei after the apocalypse began. By then, explanations were unnecessary. The sky had already turned red. Monsters filled the streets. Civilization was collapsing in real time. When Kael offered a path to survival, Chen Wei understood the value immediately. But none of that had happened yet. Now Kael was asking a complete stranger to trust him while the world still appeared perfectly normal. I'm not asking you to accept anything tonight, Kael said. That is reassuring. I only need you to listen. Chen Wei finally took a sip of coffee. I'm listening. Kael studied him for a moment. The sarcastic tone was still there, but beneath it, Chen Wei was paying attention to everything. The position of Kael's hands, the dark communicator on the table, the distance to the exit, even the reflection in the cafe window behind him. His instincts were already exceptional. Kael only needed to give those instincts something they could not ignore. You owe 280,000 credits. Chen Wei stopped moving. The humor disappeared from his face. Kael continued before he could interrupt. Most of it came from your mother's medical treatment. Silence settled between them. The quiet sounds of the convenience store suddenly seemed much louder. The refrigeration units, the automated register, the rain beginning to tap against the window. Chen Wei placed his coffee on the table. Carefully. How do you know that? I know more than that. You searched my records? No. Then someone gave you the information. No one did. Chen Wei's brown eyes hardened. Those are the only reasonable explanations. I know. Kael met his gaze. That's why I need to prove that the explanation isn't reasonable. Chen Wei said nothing. Kael activated his communicator and displayed a map of the Eastern Transit Network. He selected a location near East Ring Road. Tomorrow, at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, a maintenance drone will malfunction above this transport station. Chen Wei looked at the map, then at Kael. What? It will lose altitude and crash through the station roof. You expect me to believe that? No fatalities, Kael continued. 3 people will be injured. Chen Wei's expression remained guarded. The emergency services will arrive 6 minutes later. The first public recording will appear online at 2:21. Kael closed the map. The news will report the incident at 2:27. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Chen Wei leaned farther back in his chair. That is very specific. Because it will happen. And if it doesn't, then you never have to speak to me again. That's all? That's all. Chen Wei studied him in silence. Kael did not look away. He had witnessed that accident across dozens of lives. Sometimes the drone crashed into the station roof. Sometimes debris struck the neighboring road. Once, a delayed evacuation caused 11 deaths. But the first failure always began at the same moment. 2:14 in the afternoon. It was a small event. Meaningless compared to what would happen 6 days later. But it was close enough for Chen Wei to verify. Eventually, the delivery rider released a tired laugh. Not mockingly. Almost helplessly. You're insane. Probably. And somehow. Chen Wei's smile faded. I don't think you're lying. Kael allowed himself the faintest smile. In every timeline, Chen Wei's instincts had been one of his greatest strengths. He might reject impossible evidence. He might question every explanation. But he rarely ignored the feeling that something was wrong. Chen Wei finished his coffee and stood. Fine. He picked up his helmet from the empty chair beside him. If your prediction comes true tomorrow, I'll listen to the rest. He took several steps toward the exit, then stopped. What exactly is the job? Kael answered without hesitation. Surviving the end of the world. Chen Wei looked back at him. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he shook his head and continued toward the door. Definitely insane. The convenience store doors opened, allowing the evening rain and street noise to enter. Chen Wei stepped outside and returned to his motorcycle. Kael watched through the window as the delivery rider put on his helmet, secured the empty backpack, and disappeared into the neon traffic. Chen Wei had not agreed to join him. Not yet, but he had agreed to listen. One piece was moving into place. Slowly, but moving. Kael remained beside the cafe window until Chen Wei's motorcycle disappeared into the evening traffic. The first piece had begun to move. Not quickly, not willingly, but it was moving. His communicator vibrated. Kael's expression changed immediately. The device lay on the table beside the unfinished coffee. A familiar notification glowed across its screen. Unknown sender. Kael picked it up. A new message appeared. You found Chen Wei earlier than usual. His heart nearly stopped. Earlier than usual. Not earlier than expected. Not earlier than predicted. Earlier than usual. The distinction was small, but impossible to ignore. Those words did not describe a plan. They described repetition. They implied that Kael had recruited Chen Wei before, more than once, across different versions of the same world. Kael read the message again. The sender knew Chen Wei. They knew when Kael normally found him, and they knew this timeline was already deviating from the others. Only someone with knowledge of previous lives could speak that way. Kael's fingers tightened around the communicator. He looked through the cafe window. Chen Wei was already gone. Inside, a cashier restocked a refrigerated shelf. Two students spoke quietly beside the entrance. An exhausted office worker stared at a tablet while waiting for food. Nobody appeared interested in him. Nobody watched too closely. That meant nothing. The person contacting him had already demonstrated technology far beyond civilian systems. They could be nearby, or on the other side of the city. Kael opened the message information. No identity, no routing history, no traceable network. The encryption was even more sophisticated than before. Then another message arrived. Meet me tonight. A location appeared beneath it. Kael opened the attached map. The marker was positioned beneath Old Tianjing, far below the abandoned historic district. An underground transit station. The station had been closed decades earlier after a tunnel collapse destroyed several sections of the original subway network. Most city maps no longer displayed it. The entrances were sealed. The lower tunnels were unstable. There was no legitimate reason for anyone to go there, which made it an excellent place for an ambush. Kael studied the surrounding routes. 3 possible entrances, 2 maintenance shafts, 1 flooded service tunnel. Most security cameras in the area had been deactivated years ago. Whoever selected the location had chosen it carefully. Perhaps they expected him to notice that. Perhaps they wanted him afraid. A third message appeared. If you want to save Mei Lian this time, come alone. The cafe seemed to fall silent. Kael stared at the name. Mei Lian, the future scientist he intended to contact tomorrow. One of the first people to understand how the monsters evolved. One of the few researchers who continued searching for answers after every government laboratory collapsed. His friend. In one life, Mei Lian had developed a treatment that slowed early-stage mutation. In another, she had remained behind inside an infected city to transmit her research while thousands escaped. Kael remembered her final expression from that timeline. Exhausted, terrified, still trying to save people who would never know her name. He had failed to reach her in time. The message was not merely a warning, it was a threat, or bait. The phrase struck him hardest. This time, it meant the sender knew Mei Lian had died before. They knew Kael had tried to save her. They knew enough about his previous lives to choose the one name he could not ignore. Kael's mind moved through every possibility. Professor Shen, someone inside Project Horizon, a surveillance system that had somehow observed previous timelines, another survivor carrying memories like his own. Every answer created more questions. The safest choice was to ignore the message. Recruit Chen Wei tomorrow. Reach Mei Lian before the sender could act. Continue preparing for day 0. But if the sender truly remembered, they already knew what Kael would do. They knew his plans, his priorities, perhaps even his failures. Running would not remove the threat. It would only surrender the initiative. Kael closed the map. The abandoned station waited beneath Old Tianjing, a place no one should enter. A meeting with someone who should not exist. He slipped the communicator into his pocket and rose from the table. Whether the message was a warning or a trap no longer mattered. The sender knew about Project Horizon. They knew about Chen Wei. They knew about Mei Lian. And somehow, they remembered. Just like him. While Kael prepared to meet someone who should not exist. Far beneath the Helios headquarters, another secret was unfolding. Several hundred meters below the public research levels, beyond the laboratories, offices, and transportation systems known to ordinary employees, a secured elevator descended into darkness. It passed one restricted level, then another. Then several floors that did not appear on any official building plan. There were no windows, no public network access, no civilian communication signals. Only reinforced walls, independent power systems, and layers of military-grade security. At the lowest level, the elevator stopped. The doors opened into a narrow circular corridor. Automated scanners tracked every movement within it. Armed security personnel stood at sealed intersections, their uniforms carrying no ordinary Helios insignia. At the end of the corridor waited a chamber hidden behind multiple containment doors. Each door required a different form of authorization: biometric verification, retinal confirmation, genetic identification, a rotating security code known only to a handful of people. One by one, the barriers opened. Beyond them stood Professor Shen Guowei. The elderly scientist rested both hands upon the handle of his metallic cane. His neatly combed silver hair and formal research coat made him appear no different from the respected academic once celebrated across the scientific world. But the man standing here had vanished from public life years ago. No retirement, no funeral, no confirmed death. He had simply ceased to exist. At least according to the official record. Professor Shen stepped into the center of the chamber. The final door sealed behind him. Silence followed. The room was enormous. A circular platform occupied its center, surrounded by rings of advanced monitoring equipment. Thick cables disappeared beneath the floor, connecting the chamber to systems buried even deeper underground. No technicians were present. No assistants. Only Professor Shen and the intelligence operating the facility. A low mechanical tone echoed through the darkness. The platform activated. Light gathered above it. Fragments of crimson and black assembled in the air, gradually forming a holographic projection. Professor Shen raised his eyes. An enormous crystalline sphere appeared above the platform. It rotated slowly in complete darkness. The object's surface was smooth in some places and violently fractured in others. Countless crimson cracks spread across it like veins beneath transparent stone. Some were thin, barely visible. Others pulsed with a dim internal glow. With every pulse, the surrounding instruments recorded changes in atmospheric pressure, electromagnetic radiation, and spatial distortion. Professor Shen stared at the projection without moving. He had viewed it hundreds of times. Yet it never became easier. The sphere did not match any known mineral, any known technology, or anything humanity had discovered beyond Earth. A disembodied voice filled the chamber. Latest observation cycle complete. Rows of data appeared around the projection. Anomaly growth has increased by 17%. Professor Shen's fingers tightened around the cane. 17%. That increase should have required weeks. Instead, it had occurred in less than a day. Confirm the measurement, he said. Measurement confirmed across all active monitoring stations. Additional projections appeared around the sphere. Satellite readings, deep ocean sensor data, distortions spreading through the upper atmosphere. Each model pointed toward the same conclusion. The process was accelerating. Professor Shen looked toward a cluster of crimson fractures near the sphere's center. They were wider than they had been that morning, not by much, but enough. Cause? Unknown. External interference? No identifiable external source detected. Human activity? Probability below 0.04%. Professor Shen fell silent. If humanity had not caused the acceleration, then something else had. Something connected to the sphere, or something responding from beyond it. The voice continued. Projected breach timeline has been recalculated. Professor Shen's expression hardened. The word breach had once been theoretical, a possibility buried inside classified models. Now the system used it as certainty. How long? The chamber answered immediately. 6 days. Silence filled the room. 6 days. The same period indicated by the growing atmospheric disturbance over the Pacific. The same period remaining before the fractures reached critical instability. the same period before every prediction model collapsed into unreadable chaos. Professor Shen slowly closed his eyes. For years, Helios had studied the object in secret. They had monitored its energy, mapped its fractures, tracked the changes it produced in the atmosphere. They had convinced themselves that observation was enough, that containment was possible, that humanity still had time. They had been wrong. The sphere was no longer dormant. The atmospheric distortions were not warnings of something approaching Earth. They were evidence that the process had already begun. Professor Shen opened his eyes. The crimson fractures reflected across his glasses. He knew something no government had announced. Something no ordinary Helios researcher understood. Something no one on Earth was prepared to accept. The apocalypse was not approaching. It had already arrived. Humanity simply had not noticed yet.